on certain aspects. It's more of a discussion point of view, just to get what you're thinking about a certain situation that might come up. I'll just share my screen and get started. So hopefully everybody will be able to see something that looks a bit like a PowerPoint show with speed to fly.
Yeah, we've got it.
So this is it's the GPC Unit 40 was the kind of basis for the presentation. So on the GPC module, it requires some discussion on speed to fly, height bands, thermal selection, and when you're cruising, track selection. And they're kind of the keys to increasing your speed. So what's speed to fly? The answer to everything in gliding is it depends. There is no universal truth. So you're going to have to think about the speed to fly based on a number of things. The biggest determinant for the speed to fly is your climb rate. And this should be the actual achieved climb rate that you get from a thermal top to bottom. It is not the best number you see on the Vario at any given climb. Most people get very excited when they see a gust or bump in a thermal which says it's 8 or 9 or 10 knots, and then they kind of get optimistic ideas about their climb rate. If your Vario's got an averager, it's well worth knowing where that is to look at the average climb rate, preferably top to bottom, because that will really be the biggest determinant for your speed. Next thing is your glider. I'm lucky enough to fly an ASG 29. So an ASG 29 is obviously a very high performance 18-meter glider, full of water. It's got a very high wing loading, a very high LD, so I can fly faster. If your club only has something like a Discus CS or an LS4 or a Junior or a Lebel or something like that, you will not be able to fly as fast as someone with a very nice high performance toy. Your situation. So if you're very close to the ground, you shouldn't fly as fast as if you're very high up. Also need to take in account of other environmental factors, such as the time of day and the terrain around you, particularly if you're flying in things like hills. So in the training manual, the Gliding Australia published one. It gives some numbers for an LS4, which is a reasonably typical club glider. Be vaguely the same as something like a Discus CS, which we'll get more about later. There's some other gliders, maybe a DG 300, a few other gliders in that kind of range. So the numbers here are kind of given as a rule of thumb. So if you get a 2-knot climb, you should cruise at somewhere between 55 and 65 knots. If you've got a 4-knot climb, it's 70 to 80. A 6-knot climb is 75 to 85 knots. So I'll spend a little bit of time going over where these numbers come from and how you can work it out for your particular glider as well. So don't just take this as a rule of thumb and gospel truth, and in a 2-knot climb, I'm going to do this. Spend a little bit of time to understand it and work it out, and you'll be able to fly a little bit faster, or you may need to fly a little bit slower, depending on your glider. So the first thing is you need to know the glider that you're flying. And the way that you work out the speed to fly will all come from the polar curve. So the polar curves, you may remember, are in they're normally published in the flight manual. They're a plot of lift versus drag at a speed. So they show you your sink rate at any given speed for a glider. And you can use your polar curve to relatively easily work out your maximum duration, which is min sync, the maximum range. If you have your climb rate and using McCready theory, you can work out a approximate cross-country speed. You can also use it to kind of fudge a way to work out what speed you should fly with a headwind or a tailwind. And it also shows you the effect of wing loading. So this here is a typical polar. So you can see it's got a sink rate in meters a second versus the speed that you are flying. So up the top, it's in kilometers an hour, and down the bottom, it's in knots. And over on this side, it's got a sink rate in 100 feet per minute is approximately 1 knot. So that's a very easy way to convert feet per minute into knots. And if you look across, 1 meter per second is approximately 2 knots. So if you need to convert from meters to second to knots, it's about 2 to 1. And the mental gymnastics needed for speed's a little bit harder, but 100 knots is about 182 kilometers an hour or somewhere like that. So this shows the sync rate with speed. And if you can remember from your basic gliding knowledge, the minimum sync rate is a tangent to the curve up here. So if you just lay a horizontal line on the top of your polar, where it intersects the curve is the minimum sync. So in this case, for a discus CS, speed is somewhere around the 47 knots, assuming your wing loading is about 3 kilograms a square meter. And your max range is where you lay a tangent from the origin. Notice that this doesn't have a 0, this starts at 60. So the origin is actually way out to the left. So that's why this curve, if you extrapolate it further, if you extrapolate the curve out, it will intersect the origin at 0 kilometers an hour. And for a discus CS, your max range speed is somewhere around the 57 knots, and the lift drag is about 43 1. Bear in mind that every polar is a manufacturer's marketing tool, so take it with a grain of salt. It may or may not be the world's most accurate. So you might have heard of McCready theory. So McCready theory is named for a guy called Paul McCready. He was he's a very clever guy, and among other things, he was the 1956 World Gliding Champion in open class. He designed numerous human-powered aircraft. You may or may not have heard, depending on your age, of a Gossamer Condor and Gossamer Albatross. The Gossamer Albatross, I think, was the first human-powered aircraft to fly across the English Channel. And he also got interested in flying dinosaurs and designed a flying pterosaur. So there are some pictures of some of the things that he made. The upper one's a human-powered aircraft, and then the lower ones is flying pterosaur. McCready theory is based on the time spent in a climb and the speed you need to fly between them. And pre-McCready, pilots would climb in a thermal, then fly at the max range speed until they got the next thermal. And Paul McCready did some calculation. He demonstrated that the faster the next climb is, the faster you should fly between the climbs. And if you find yourself in rising air, you should slow up a little bit. And if you find yourself in sinking air, you should speed up a bit. So that way you spend less time in sinking air and more time in rising air. So overall, you will end up in a better position than if you just flew at a constant max range speed. And he also invented a speed ring, which is a device you put on the variometer to enable you to work out what speed to fly without actually having to think about it a great deal. So the way the McCready ring works is that you set this arrow here to your climb rate on the vario. So if you are going to get a climb rate of 2 meters a second or 4 knots, you would move that arrow up onto the 2, and then where your vario needle is, it indicates the speed that you should fly. And in this case, it's a speed in kilometers an hour, and your climb rate is in meters per second. But this is just an example, and I wouldn't worry too much about the units on this. When the needle starts moving up and down, it moves around on this dial here and gives you the speed that you should fly. So this here is, I'll come back to the McCready theory in a little second. I'll show you how the McCready theory works. So this is a full discus CS polar. So I've extended it back to the origin. So now we have a 0 kilometers an hour. So you can see it starts at 60. Manufacturers normally just drop off this bottom end to save space. Everything else about it's the same, and I've just extrapolated this line from the original polar up just to prove to you that it does intersect at least somewhere vaguely near the origin. So if you're not climbing, if you're in still air, you fly, you get a 43 in one lift drag. McCready theory says that if you can climb at 3 knots, you start up here at 3 knots, which is a climb rate of about 300 feet a minute, as distinct from a sink rate of 300 feet a minute down here. And you can lay the curve from this climb rate, which is when you're thermaling. And as far as the ground is concerned, this is, you're traveling at about 0 kilometers an hour. And you get the tangent to the curve, and you can see in this case, the tangent to the curve is somewhere around the 75 knots. And the intersection here says if you've got a 3-knot climb, you should be cruising at approximately 78 knots. And then the intersection up here is your approximate cross-country speed. So it's just a little bit less than. So if your next climb is 3 knots, you cruise about just under 80 knots, and your cross-country speed will be about 80 kilometers an hour. The next one here, if we just take it up to 4 knots, you can see it intersects a bit further down. This purple line here is showing a bit further down, and you can see the speed's to something like 83, 84 knots. And the speed is increasing. So the faster you climb, the faster you should cruise, and the faster your cross-country speed is. And then I've done this for a few more climbs just to get the idea of, whoops, I've got to, so you can see here, if you go 3, 4, 5, 6 knots, the speed you should cruise also increases, and your cross-country speed also increases. Just remember that these climb rates are an average achieved climb rate. They are not the best you get in your thermal. This one here, the second curve, I'm sure most of you will be aware, is for a ballasted glider. And this one here, the Discus CS, you can ballast up to 50 kilograms a square meter. That's its maximum. When you fill it with water, you can expect your climb rate to be slightly worse than if you are dry. You can't turn as tightly, you can't get into the core. And you can see here that this dashed line is with a 5-knot climb rate. It intersects this other polar curve much further out. So the speed you should be flying on this one is around 105 knots, much higher than your 90-knot cruise. And then you can see here that it makes a difference of about 6 kilometers an hour to your average speed. So that's the advantage of water ballast. But for the rest of the presentation, basically, I'll just talk about the single unballasted curve. You can redo all of these calculations based on the actual wing loading that you will fly, but I'll just limit it to this single curve at the moment. So the other thing is what happens if we vary the cruise speed. So if my next climb is 4 knots, if I cruise at 65 knots, I've decided that I'm going to cruise at 65 knots, which is here. So I've intersected the curve, and it gives me a cross-country speed of about 85 kilometers an hour, and my sink rate is about 180 feet a minute, or 1. If I cruise at 75 knots, this has all slipped down a little. I'm not quite sure. Might need to edit this presentation. If I cruise at 75 knots with the same climb rate, it should intersect down here on this curve about here. So that gives me a cruise speed of about 75. Why is it not working properly? Where's my other line gone? So I'll just try and edit it. Editing on the fly is always a good choice. It's not quite sure where my lines have gone. But if you cruise at 65 knots, the cross-country speed's about 85 kilometers an hour, and your sink rate is about 180, which is here. If we cruise 75 knots, which is going to be this line here, it will intersect the curve about here. My sink rate is about 230 feet a minute. This line is not representative of that. If I cruise at 84 knots, my line is out here. My cross-country speed is going to be about 89 kilometers an hour. My sink rate has gone up to 290 feet a minute, which is the intersection of the curve here. And if I cruise at 90 knots, you can see my speed has now gone down and my sink rate has gone up by an enormous amount. So this is showing what happens if you fly too fast. If you fly too fast, your sink rate goes up and you don't actually go any faster. And if you slow up a bit, your speed doesn't change a great deal, but your sink rate drops an enormous amount. So if in doubt, just slow up a bit. This is a way that you can look at the effect of wind. So if you have a 30 knot tailwind, if you cruise a little bit slower, you cruise at about 74 knots, and with a 4 knot headwind, and it shows you that you should be cruising a little bit faster. So this is just offset by the speed of the wind. So the tailwind, you set the origin further back, and the headwind, you set it forward. And in still air, the cruise was 84 knots. So you should increase the speed a little bit in a headwind, and you should decrease it a little bit in a tailwind for efficient flight. Someone's popped up a question. Oh, it's just a comment on the mic. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm not quite sure what I can do about my mic.
It sounds like you've got a voice activated mic there, Richard. It's cutting in and out a bit.
Okay, I'll see if I can change a setting. It should be on all the time. I thought I'd put it on all of the time. So this little chart here shows the effect of cruise versus climb rate versus cross-country speed. So there's quite a little bit in this graph, but if you can climb at 1 knot, you cruise at 60 knots, then your average cross-country speed should be around here, about 75. And then here's the optimum speed to cruise if you have a 1 knot climb, and you can see that your speed has increased by about 3 kilometers an hour. If you increase your interthermal speed to 100 knots, you can see you actually get slower, but the difference isn't that great. If you come up here, you can see the same curve for 2 knots, same curve for 3 knots, the same curve for 4 knots, and then the same for 5 and the same for 6. So the real message for this is the best possible way to increase your cross-country speed is to improve your thermaling. These curves do not overlap. If your average is 2 knots, basically, no matter what speed you fly, your cross-country speed will be a lot quicker than if you have an average of 1 knot. If you get to 3 knots, again, you have to do a lot wrong to be slower than 2 knots. 4 knots is the same. So the biggest single factor in cross-country speed is your ability to thermal. If you can thermal really well, you spend a lot less time climbing, and you can go a lot faster. So everything gets better with better thermaling. So McCready theory and dolphin flying, they're kind of related. The dolphin flying is you slow up in rising air and you speed up in sinking air. And both of them require your speed to fly to be determined by the climb rate in your next climb. So you need to gaze into the future and have a look at what's coming up next, rather than where you've been. The basis of the theory is the faster the climb rate, the faster that you should fly between thermals. You should also slow down in lift. The original dolphin theory said you should slow down to your minimum sink speed, and you speed up in sink. And you should speed up to your McCready setting. Both methods have been largely superseded. And the reasons for this is it's very hard to fly and inefficient with constant acceleration and deceleration. All of the moving of the controls is drag, and you find yourself accelerating and decelerating all of the time. It's reactive because you can't predict the future. You find yourself reacting when your vario tells you you're in rising air. And then you slow up, and often you slow up just in time to hit sink. And then you find that you have to accelerate in sinking air, which is something you don't want to do. The modern gliders, particularly water ballasted gliders, have a much larger speed range to the gliders that existed when the theory was developed in the 50s and 60s. So it's a lot more difficult to slow up a glider, time consuming and more consuming. It's just as easy to slow up a 600 kilogram glider traveling at 110 knots compared to a 450 glider. So this larger speed range makes it more difficult to constantly accelerate and decelerate. You also have a situation where you find yourself chasing a vario. So the higher sink rate when you accelerate to a higher speed, your vario on speed to fly then tells you that your higher sink rate means you should fly faster. So then you fly faster and then you get a higher sink rate. So then you fly faster again and you find yourself chasing it, chasing a higher speed. So the reason why that they've been, just wondering if I just noticed another message, just checking that. They've been largely replaced by the block speed approach. And this gets back to that last graph I showed you with all of the curves stacked on top of each other. The speed you fly is not that critical to your overall achieved cross-country speed. So there's no need to fixate on it. Varying the speed from plus or minus 10 knots from the optimum can vary your cross-country speed by as little as 1 to 2 kilometers an hour. So you're much better off picking a speed and flying to it rather than trying to chase pure Macready flying or dolphin flying. The recommended block speed is the one that you determine from your polar, plus 5 knots, minus 10 knots. Particularly if you're not very experienced, slowing up a bit is a much better decision than speeding up a bit. You get a much better feel for the air, so you'll know whether you're in rising air more easily than if you just fly at 100 knots the whole time. The sink rate is lower, which means you have less climbing, and you have more time to think and more time to plan your next move. If you have a positive visual cue, and the normal visual cues that you would get are cumulus clouds or other glide tunneling, you do have a way to look into the future and see what might be happening. Alarm also enables you to cheat and see what climb rate the other gliders have around you as well. So if you see a glider up ahead within range climbing quite well, you'll just fly to them and they'll give you a clue, and you might be able to slow up a little bit before you get there. And you can take advantage of the fact that you know that lift is there. And when you have a bit more experience and you get a better feel for the air, you can keep driving. If you look at the traces from the really good pilots, the ones who will be competing at Narromine in a couple of months' time, you'll be able to download their traces from Soaring Spot or wherever they're publishing them, and you can have a look at their traces and you can see what they do, and it's extraordinary. They keep on driving, they feel the air, and when they get into a climb, they kind of commit absolutely, nail it first time every time. And there's only one way to do that, and that's fly. So with the wind, the way I like to think of it is the tailwind is pushing you along. So if you've got a tailwind, you just slow down and you'll be in the air for longer. So that's more time, which means the tailwind will push you further along. With a headwind, you need to speed up a little bit because that's less time to get blown back. The speed changes you need to compensate for wind are normally relatively small. If you think back to the slide from 3 or 4 slides ago, where the polar with the wind, you could see if you had 30 kilometre an hour wind, the speed range didn't vary that much. It was still within the normal block speed range. So In a headwind, I'd speed up by about 5 knots, and in a slow down by about 10 knots. The kind of normal way of doing business. Wing loading. Water ballast is an acquired taste. You can certainly fly faster with water on the proviso that it doesn't adversely affect your climb rate. A lot of people also want to fly very heavy as they possibly can. That may affect their climb rate. And the biggest determinant in your success in cross-country speed will be your climb rate. So if you're a relatively inexperienced pilot, consider whether you are actually ready to fly with water or not. And you might physically be able to control the glider fine, but if it's affecting your climb rate too much, you're actually doing yourself a disservice, and you're better off just waiting until you've got more skill and experience to climb better before you try and fly very heavy. The wing loading, a high wing loading gives you a cruise bonus and a climb penalty. It's really a subject of another lecture, and it is a different GPC module. And just remember that the climb rate has much more effect on your cross-country speed than wing loading. You're much better off getting an extra 1 knot on your average speed to average climb rate than being able to cruise more efficiently. So you kind of need to know your glider and assess the conditions. So the speed to fly varies a lot with your glider. So if you fly a LaBelle versus something like an ASW-28 versus one of the new super ships of a JS3 or something like that, the speed you fly will be very, very, very different. One thing that I forgot to mention it before, I might just something to remember on some of the polars. This is the Discus CS one, and it's got a kind of kink about here. That's a kind of limit to the cross-country speed that you can get out of a discus. So when you look at these, as you increase the climb rate and lay these curves on, they all kind of end up crossing over about here. So you need an exceptional day to want to increase your cruise speed up to beyond about 80, 90 knots. And that's an artifact of this polar with a kind of kink in it. The main difference between a flapped glider polar versus an unflapped is the flapped glider will be slightly flatter out here, and it probably won't have the kink. But have a look at your individual aircraft and see whether it does have something in it like that. So that's effectively a top speed limit on the Discus CS or the earlier Discus, the Discus A's and B's. So
We've totally lost you, Richard.
I'm not talking. Can you hear me again?
I can now, yeah.
You can now? Okay. So the Discus CS has this kink in the polar, which puts an effective limit on the cruise speed. Just remember, the higher the wing loading, the faster you should fly. In a tailwind, slow up, headwind, speed up. If you look ahead, you can, particularly if there's clouds, you can work out the best place to fly by looking at the clouds. And you can also see a change in conditions. It's very common to look ahead and see that the clouds are stopping and you're about to fly into the blue, or vice versa. You're about to go from blue to cloudy. You might see some overdevelopment up ahead. You might see something else like hills or forests or changes in terrain. So make sure you keep looking ahead and choosing the best path that you possibly can. And the better the climb, the faster you should fly. Stress that the climb rate that you want to use is the average from top to bottom, not the peak. And that little comment on the better the climbs, the faster you should fly is subject to a disclaimer with working height band. So that's kind of the end of the first part of the presentation, which talks about the polar and laying lines on a polar and working out speeds and things. So if anyone's got any questions on that, it might be an appropriate place to pause and deal with any questions that people might have. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, or doesn't sound like there's any questions at the moment. So I'll move on to the next bit, which is on working height bands. So this here was taken from a book which breaks up your working height bands into 3 bands and calls them an operating height band, a caution height band, and a survival height band. And I think they're fairly self-explanatory. The operating height band is where you want to be. On this hypothetical day, there's nice soft white fluffy cumulus clouds. The bottom of the clouds is about 9,000 feet, and they're showing that they've got roughly 4-knot climbs. So that would be a pretty good day out. The way the book broke them up is it broke them up into very uneven height bands. I'd suggest that these are appropriate height bands if you are a more experienced pilot. But if you're slightly less experienced, it's probably better to try and have a sort of a 30-30-30 split. And so your survival height band would be about 3,000 feet. Your caution height band would be 6,000, and then your operating height band would be 6,000 to 9,000 feet. So that's the simplest of ways to break it up. On a 9,000 foot day, that works really well because you get 3,000, 3,000, 3,000. If you've got a 6,000 foot day, it doesn't work so well because your survival height band is only 2,000 feet. So you need to be open to the prospect of adjusting it, basing it based on the conditions on the day. I would suggest that the way it's shown here is for a much more experienced pilot, and you'll find that the guys who are flying in high level competitions will have a bigger operating height band. They will push much deeper. And remember that when you are getting low, safety is your #1 priority. Don't continue to push unsafe condition. You're much better off outlanding and trying again another day rather than pushing it and bending a glider, or worse, bending yourself by pushing it and then leaving yourself insufficient time to make a paddock landing decision, or flying yourself into a position with no paddock landing conditions. So the other thing which is shown on this is that you don't need to take every climb. Here, the way this little scenario is drawn is you've got a nice 4-knot climb here. You take it up to just below cloud base, you cruise off, take another 4-knot climb. Down here, you've given up a 3-knot climb. You've gone through, you've just slowed up a little bit. You've got a benefit from the height gain, but you decided 3 knots is not enough. 4 knots was what I was getting back here, so I'm going to give it a miss. And at point D here, there was a 2-knot climb, and again, that wasn't necessary to take the 2-knot climb. And then you've come back here at point E, and you've hit a 4-knotter, and the 4-knotter has been taken the whole way back up to cloud base. So if you don't take the 3-knot climb and don't take the 2-knot climb, your average climb rate from here is going to be 4 knots, which is much better than stopping here at 3, which would reduce it down to 3.5 or whatever it is. Much better than not taking a 2, which would drop it down to about 3 knots, less than 3 knots. So here it's all going really well. here they've missed, you've given up a 1 knotter, which is fine, given up a 3 knotter. And then with hindsight, that turned out to be not a good decision, because then you got yourself down low. But you can't tell that. You can't forecast exactly what's going to happen. You've got clouds here that all look good. But when you've got yourself down in the caution band, you have to be prepared to accept a lower climb rate. So in this case, they've taken a 2-knot climb, but notice that they didn't take it the whole way up to the top. They took it back up into a comfortable range where they felt confident in cruising off and finding another climb. In this particular scenario, it didn't work for them because they found out that they ended up in a survival height band. They took a 1/2 knot climb just to stay alive, and then moved along, and then bang, straight into a 4 knotter, which they then took to cloud base. With hindsight, you would have been much better off taking your 3 knotter here, back up to cloud base, and then tracking off to this 4 knotter, but that's unknowable. So with the working height bands, the speed to fly varies based on your position in the height band. So if you're in your operating height band or working height band, the suggestion is that you stay on track and you accept only the best climbs. That's on a blue day. If you've got cumulus clouds, plan your track to intercept the clouds. Deviations of kind of 15 degrees to 20 degrees off track. That's a double F, by the way. Off track are fine. You will normally gain back the climb by going under the cloud that you lost by the deviation. And you should accept only the best climbs. Your speed to fly would be at the upper end of the block speed range, and basically go for it because times are good. In the caution band, you'd consider small deviations to likely thermal sources. This is obviously a blue day, so you don't have a nice soft white fluffy cloud to indicate where the lift is. But if you look down on the ground, you might see things which are more likely, darker paddocks. You might see a willy, dust devil. Might see a forested area that an edge of the forest might help trip up a thermal or something like that. If you see another glider, you might deviate towards them. And you should be open to accepting slightly weaker climbs than what you would have in your working height band. If you've got cumulus clouds, you could deviate 20 to 30 degrees off track to intercept the clouds to maximize your chances. And again, you can accept slightly weaker climbs. Probably slow up a bit to the lower end of the block speed band, and that will give you a lower sink rate and better feel. If you're in survival mode, basically you do whatever you can. Do whatever you can to stay alive. Accept larger deviations to thermal sources, and you should take any climb you can get, but you don't necessarily want to take it to the top. And you need to make absolutely sure that you have a safe outlanding option if things don't go your way. If you think a likely thermal source is over rocky ground, but you don't have enough height to get back to an outlandable paddock, don't do it. You can't rely on a thermal source which looks good actually delivering you a good climb. And it's the same if it's a forested area. You need to make absolutely certain that in survival mode you have an outlandable option. If you've got clouds, the further away you are from cloud base, the less reliable the cloud becomes. So it's harder to rely on clouds when you're a long way removed from them. So you might need to look for lift upwind of a cloud. And again, you accept weaker climbs. You do whatever you take to stay alive. You need to slow down a little bit more to extend your range and improve your feel. But just be careful not to slow down to your minimum sink speed just because you're getting a bit low, because you might find yourself traveling through sink that you're too slow and it's decreased your sink rate or increased your sink rate so much that you can't get through that particular patch of sink, which will force you to outland. So here are some scenarios to think about. If the convection is going to 6,000 feet, you've had 5 knot climbs and it's blue, and you're over flat ground. Would anyone like to volunteer what their operating height band might be? What they would feel comfortable? Don't be shy and don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'd probably be in about down to 3.5, up to 6,000. I'm flying a Jantar, so I'm probably going to be cruising at about 80 knots dry, and yeah, just keeping an eye on paddock to paddock or paddock regions. But that's what I'd be aiming to do.
Yep. Anyone else? Their thoughts? Don't forget to unmute. All very shy. Thanks, Dave, for participating. Other than Dave, if you're going to 10,000 feet, you're getting 10-knot climbs, you've got soft, white, fluffy clouds, and you're over the flat. What would someone else like to offer up as a working height band they'd be comfortable with? I might have to pick on someone. Go through.
5 to 10.
Yeah, no one else is going to volunteer?
5 to 10.
5 to 10 would be an operating height band. And what about your caution?
2 to 5.
2 to 5. And then 1 to 2. I'd probably suggest a little bit higher than that, because the further away you are from the cumulus, the less of a guide they would be. So I would have thought your 5 to 10 is probably okay. 6 to 10 is probably more conservative. And then I'd say 3 to 6 would be a good kind of caution band, unless you're feeling really confident. In which case, yeah, drop it down to 2, but 2 gives you basically no wiggle room. Another scenario is convection is 10,000 feet. You've been getting 8 knots all day. It's now 6 o'clock at night, and you are 140 kilometres from home. What do you think a good working height band would be? And what climb rate would you accept?
Oh, I'm going to answer, Richard. I wouldn't want to be getting more than a couple of thousand feet below the cloud at 6 p.m. at night, and I'd be cruising at about 75 knots, and taking anything that would probably be 4 or 5 or better.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's getting later on in the day. Sometimes you had extraordinary conditions late in the day. One particularly memorable climb was about 8 p.m. and it was a 9-knot climb up to 12,500 feet, and I needed every bit of it, and it was just absolutely extraordinary. No idea where it came from, but I was very grateful. But later on in the day, you don't expect to get good climbs, and it's much more important to stay in contact with the clouds. So,
some of us might have final glide.
Pardon?
Some of us might have final glide.
Yeah.
I wasn't flying at 29 at that stage, but 12,500 feet, 140k from home, I'd probably be on it now.
Brash is used to his 87-metre wingspan, so it's all right.
I would be on final glide as well, so I didn't bother.
Yeah. Well, there's no need for everyone to show off.
If you're in a real man's glider, Brash, you still got to work.
Yeah. So maybe I should, for those, is that a JS3 in the background?
Yes.
Yeah, if it's a JS3, I'll change it for you to 200 kilometres from home. Is yours, have you got a sustainer in yours?
Yeah, I've got the res. So if I was 200 at that height from home, I wouldn't worry.
Well, in that case, because you've got the res, I'll make it 300 for you. And then the other scenario you might like to think about is if you're 8,000 foot above, convection's going to 8,000 feet, you've got cumulus clouds, and you're in mountains with 5,000 foot high peaks. You might need to think a bit more about what altitude you are going to drop down to. and also the nature of the mountains. So if they're kind of broad, flat plateaus, then obviously the 5,000-foot summit is kind of a real obstacle. But if they're higher peaks and they're more, something like a Mount Fuji or something like that, where you can just fall off the side and your glider will have a sink rate much lower than the terrain around you. You might like to just consider the way you would handle that situation. So the main reason for putting up these scenarios is just to make you think a little bit about the working height bands, and that they do change. They may change throughout the day. So the scenarios there, going to 10,000 feet with cumulus clouds, what you will accept and what you won't accept changes if it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 6 o'clock or even 8 o'clock. You would make different decisions on what to accept and how fast to fly based on where you are in the day and what's going on around you. If you look up ahead and see a thunderstorm, you also might change your decision because you might need to route around it. So you just need to think about a lot more than a single number when you're thinking about working height bands. Here is on thermal selection, basically just reinforcing that you don't need to take every climb. Everyone, when they start out, takes every climb. I took every climb. Everyone else I've known who's started cross-country flying has taken every climb. The best way to increase your cross-country climb rate average to fly through on a day where you've got 6-knot climbs is to bypass your 2-knot and 3-knot climbs and only take the 6-knotters. So take the leap and leave the chaff, and I can assure you, you do not need every thermal. People in the club say, yeah, you don't need every thermal because you've got 18 meters and 50 in one. But 43 in one and 15 meters, you still don't need to take it. You might need to take more, but you don't need to take every one. The other thing that's important is often you don't get a good, strong climb the whole way up the top. So when business is dropping off, you should leave. Some of the gadgets give you a climb rate over altitude. Or gives you a nice little plot of climb rate with altitude, and you can see where the peak climb rate is on a given day. So if you want a 6-knot average from top to bottom, when your climb rate average drops below 6 knots, leave. There's nothing that says you have to go up to the top of the cloud every time. And in some cases, it's not worth it. A lot of people also hang on. They've come in, they've initiated the climb, they've centered it well, they've climbed up, they've got to about here, and they've got a 6-knot average. And then because they're fixated on getting to cloud base, by the time they get up to cloud base, they've dropped back down to a 4-knot average or something like that. So you do not need to take all of the climbs to the top. Just remember that you can leave them when business starts dropping. The best way to improve the speed is to find better thermals and improve your average climb rate. Another thing is you do not need to climb to cloud base early in a street. So in this little scenario here, they're flying through a whole lot of lift, finding a 4-knotter, going up and then just milking the cloud to the end, and then accelerating off the end of the cloud. Helmut Reichmann, in his book, he recommends that you do not fly up to cloud base in the start of a cloud street. His theory or reasoning is that you find yourself then flying faster through rising air as you get drawn up into the cloud. So you accelerate to stop going into the cloud. And then you find yourself decelerating when you hit the sinking air. So the Reichmann recommendation is that you don't go completely to cloud base. And then as you're tracking along here, you would try and milk, for example, this 3-knot climb to slow up a bit more, take advantage of it, and then you can accelerate through the sinking air, which would be between these climbs. So this here is just a thing on thermal selection and climb rates. On the left of the chart is a climb rate in minutes, a time to climb in minutes, and this is a time to climb 5,000 feet. So if you have a 1-knot climb, it's about 100 feet a minute, it'll take you 50 minutes to climb 5,000 feet, which is an absolute eternity. And I would admire anyone who has the patience to stay in the one spot for 50 minutes climbing at 1 knot. If you find a 2 knot climb, it'll only take you 25 minutes to climb that 5,000 feet. So if you can improve your climb rate from 1 knot to 2 knots, you can save 25 minutes, which is an absolutely extraordinary time saving. The thing about it though, is it's an exponential decay. So let's have the happy thought that you've nailed a 10 knot climb from top to bottom. So to climb 5,000 feet, it only takes you 5 minutes. If you've got a 9 knot climb, it'll take you about 5.5 minutes. So if you find yourself in a 1 knot climb and you're going to stay there to climb 5,000 feet, it will take you an eternity. So you're much better off leaving that and going and finding a 2 knot, because it'll save you 25 minutes. And if you see another glider down the road, which is climbing at 3 knots, and it's not too far away and you can get there, it's well worth chasing, because you're on the end of the exponential curve to make a massive difference to your climb rate. If you're happily ensconced in a 9 knot climb and you're perfectly centered and you're going up, and then you see, for example, on your farm that someone a couple of kilometers away is going at 10 knots, or one of your co-pilots smugly calls in on the radio and says, you know, I've got a 10 knotter here. It is really not worth your while leaving your 9 knot climb to go and chase 10. The best you will ever do is save 30 seconds. If your mate 2 Ks down the road is climbing at 10 knots, the chance of you getting there, centering the climb, nailing 10 knots and recovering any time you might have lost is really, 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 really small. So there comes a point where leaving a good solid climb on the prospect of finding a better one is not really worth it. So I found this useful. I find this kind of thinking about this useful to determine whether I want to leave a climb or not. If I'm happily in a 6 or 7 knot climb and I can see, or someone else, you know, boasts that they're in a better climb and they're nearby, if I've got a 6 or 7 knot, the chance of me leaving it to go and chase a 9 is really, really, really small, because the time gap benefits are small. If I'm in a 2 knotter and someone, you know, a kilometre down the road's got a 9 knotter, I'll leave my 2 knotter for sure and go to 9, because I can save 15 minutes. And that is well worth, 15 minutes is well worth having. 30 seconds, I'm not really a competition pilot. I've flown in a couple of comps, but not many. Mainly I do distance. And 30 seconds isn't going to be the be all and end all for me on any given day. So just think about that as well. If you've got a really low climb rate and it's safe to do so, you might want to leave it and chase something better, because you can save big, big, big chunks of time. If you're already happily centered in a 7 to 8 knot climb, the chance of you being able to do better just because you think there's a 9 or 10 knot down the road is also quite small. So just think about that. If you're flying for a world championship or an Australian national title or something like that, you might be prepared to take the risk. But it's an exponential decay in climb rate, and the lower end is the big end. And if you can turn a 3 knot into a 4 knot in this scenario, you will save 5 minutes. You know, 6 to 7, yeah, it's less than a minute. And then from here on, if you've got 10 knots, it's pretty good. Obviously 20 knots is better, but they're very, 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 very rare.
I think from a comp perspective, Richard, if you did decide to go from your 8 to your 10, you would be doing that more so that you can stay in contact with other pilots, other aircraft, than you would to optimize your time.
Yeah, but you also need to contemplate, are you actually going to get the 10 knots?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've all chased people that are getting ballistically good climb rates only to feel the weight of disappointment.
So that's, you know, are you better off staying in your 8 knotter for a few more turns to get an extra few hundred feet and then try and stalk them in the cruise? rather than leaving your perfectly good 8-knot climb a little bit early to try and get a 10-knot climb that you don't find. So certainly if you're a distance pilot, leaving 8 knots to chase 10 on a whim and a fancy is not the best move. In a competition, it might be different. It also depends on the respective heights. If you're at 8,000 feet climbing at 8 knots and you look a kilometre down the road and there's people at 4,000 feet climbing at 10, and you can now get back in contact with them and you reckon you can join on top of them, then that's a different decision as well. So this here, it's the same chart as, or the same scenario as previously. It was mentioning about taking climbs to the top, or not taking climbs to the top, and just the luck of it, or how unknowable it is to be able to predict the future. Under these clouds, for example, they kind of all look the same. That one looks slightly better. But the higher you are, the fussier you can be, and the faster you should fly. And the chasing the ultimate climb rate is sometimes a little bit counterproductive. So quite a long time ago, there was a talk about dolphin flying. Dolphin flying is kind of slowing up in sync and slowing up in lift rather than slowing down in sync. Hang on, slowing up in lift and speeding up in sync. And that's quite inefficient. And you often find yourself out of phase with the lift and the sync. So the suggestion these days, and G. Dale talks about it in his lectures, he says, don't fly like a dolphin, fly like a shark, and deviate left to right rather than up and down, and try and find these pockets of rising air. If each one of those little circles with rising air on it is a cumulus cloud, you're in with a pretty good shot of looking up ahead and being able to pick this track. If you are on a blue day, you have to do it by feel, and that takes a lot more practice. And you need to just kind of, I kind of imagine that I'm trying to balance on top of a blade of a knife or something like that. And if your right wing lifts up a bit, well, you ease a little bit to the right. And if the numbers get better, then you keep going to the right. And if they get worse, well, you deviate back a bit. And it's a tricky skill. And I've flown with really good pilots like John Buchanan and Bruce Taylor and others who've represented Australia at the World Championships. And to be brutally honest, I don't know how they do it. They can almost kind of see the air. They go along and then they're making these little kind of deviations, and then they find their climb rate is improving. They've done it a lot. They've got thousands and thousands and thousands of hours, and obviously got a really good feel. And it demonstrates that it can be done. So rather than flying like a dolphin and soaring back and forth on the control column and going up and slowing down and accelerating again, just try and deviate left and right and try and feel your way through the air, particularly if you've got visual indicators like other gliders thermaling or cumulus clouds. They can really help you pick an optimum track through the air. So the other thing is that these days there's various different gadgets. So one of them is a Vario, and these days a lot of gliders, even in clubs, have pretty good electronic Varios, things like LX S80s or S100s, even the older Borgelts and things, some of the Tasmans. They've got average climb rates. Integrators is often something that they are called. If you've got a mechanical one with a McCready ring, it's still worthwhile learning how to use that. So these gadgets can do a lot of the thinking for you. The electronic ones, S100s and so on, they have speed to fly indicators. They have thermal averages. They have all sorts of other things in them which are useful for you. which can present the information to help you improve your decision making. Tactical glide computers really, really, really help. They exist for a reason. Basically, get one. Examples of them are the advantage of XCSAW is it's free. It's free. It runs on an Android phone or device. My very, very, very strong recommendation is that you spend an extra $150 and buy a dedicated device to run XCSAW on. Numerous club members have landed with their phone batteries completely flat because they were running their tactical glide computer on their phone. One of them had a backup battery and his backup battery went flat as well. And should you outland, your phone is by far and away the most useful thing you can possibly have. So for the sake of $150, you can have a separate device to run your gliding software and leave your phone to be a phone. Obviously, not everyone will agree, but if you are going to run it on your phone, make sure that you have a way of guaranteeing that you have battery power on your phone should you outland. Another one's a Nano 4, which is a little one, and UDIs are kind of dedicated computers. The UDI 2 or UDI IGC is a pretty good one. It was replaced a couple of years ago by the UDN, and both of those are excellent. I have run with UDI2s, UDNs, XCSAW, and some of the LX things. On one occasion, just to see what would happen, I filled my cockpit with more instruments than was good for me, just to see what data it gave. And XCSAW and UDI2 basically gave indistinguishable data as far as speed to fly and final glide and so on and so forth. So just because XCSAW is free, it doesn't mean it's no good. It is a very good product. And if you're on a bit of a budget, then I would suggest XCSAW on $150 Android is a very, very, very good device. With the Varios, a lot of Varios will be able to Bluetooth data to your phone. So that will give you actual air data. And if you have some of the FLARMs, they can also Bluetooth FLARM data to your phone. And that will mean you can see the FLARM targets as a collision avoidance thing on your phone as well. So it's well worth getting one and working out how to use it. And basically all of that stuff in the first part of tonight's session on laying lines on polars and working out speed to fly and intercepts of curves and tangents and all of that sort of stuff, the computer will do it for you. You enter the wing loading you've got, you enter the polar of the glider that you have, and the computer does the rest for you. And it really, really simplifies decision making, enables you to focus on what's happening outside. So if you don't have one, I would say get one. So the speed to fly depends. By far and away, it depends on your ability to climb. So I've got thermal strength there, but it's really your average climb rate is the big your speed. Wing loading, the air mass you're in, the glider, the altitude you're getting to on a day, the wind, etc. They're all contributing factors, and you should think about these things when you're deciding which speed to fly. These days, the overwhelming preference is to kind of use a block speed. Don't fly pure McCready and chase the speed by soaring back and forth on the control column. Use a block speed, and you only need to adjust your block speeds a little for conditions such as wind or wing loading or so on. And your computer can help you with all of that. So if you get yourself a gadget and put your polar in and your wing loading and so on, it will do all the hard yards for you. Pick your track. So you should cruise like a shark, not a dolphin these days. So think about lateral deviations, not pitch deviations, and just fly your block speed. If you're out, slow up a little bit, and then try and deviate back and forth to find the best air. Everything gets better with better thermaling, and you don't need to take every one. make sure you leave the rubbish and only take the caveat, of course, that when you're low, take whatever you can and don't hang on to them too long. When they start to drop off, or if you lose them, sometimes thermals can be a bit tricky to hang on to, particularly in conditions. If you've lost it, you've lost it. There's no point turning on hope. And then you can always go and try another. And the technological aids these days that we've got are extraordinary, and they're very affordable. So my overwhelming recommendation is to learn how to use it. I did wonder if I should discuss this. It's a little bit more kind of advanced, and I haven't got the nice little graphic that I wanted to have. It was on Varios, and it was just a quick summary of total energy versus netto. So total energy tells you the kind of absolute performance of the glider. The netto tells you whether you're in a rising air mass or sinking air mass. Total energy is fantastic for climbing, and netto is pretty good for cruising, because if the needle is above zero in netto, it means the air around you is rising. It doesn't necessarily mean your glider is rising. It means the air is rising or sinking. So in cruise, if you have an ability to set one, if you've got two Varios, for example, and you've got a cruise climb, setting one to netto and leaving another on total energy can be a very useful. That was all I had to say. If anyone's got any questions, or if anyone else wants to, any of the other experienced pilots out there, such as those with nice shiny new JS3s or older Jantars or other things like that, wish to
Can I just add a comment, Richard? I really enjoyed this presentation, and I think what was really important is that you stressed that it's not average climb rate, what the weather on the day determines, but it's what we make of it, because different pilots will have different climb rates, and it's so important for each one of us to improve our climb rates. I think that's the biggest point that I take away.
If you want to get a hint on your climb rate, it's well worth looking on OLC or WeGlide or one of the kind of internet sites. So it's really difficult to assess how you're actually doing by yourself. So one day you can have a fantastic day and you can have an average speed over 100 kilometers an hour and you feel like you're nailing every climb, and you have a look at your stats and they're really good. And then the next day you have a look and, I only averaged 85 kilometers an hour and it was hopeless and I couldn't center anything. But if you look at what everyone else is doing on that day, on the good day, you might have been having, you'll probably be doing the same as everybody else. And then on a bad day, you'll probably be doing the same as everybody else as well. So you can't just say, oh, well, I had a really good day. Now I'm expecting to get climb rates of 4 knots or something like that. You need to adjust your expectations with the conditions.
Yeah, what I tend to do, I've done for many seasons, is actually look what Toby Geiger does and then take that as a yardstick and see how much worse I am and how that compares to everyone else.
Yeah, Toby Geiger's extraordinary.
But that's, I think that's the comparison we all should be making on WeGlide or the OLC, to just have a look how everyone else has done on the same day, and whether they've gone in the same direction, for instance, as well.
Yeah.
And also broadly similar gliders. So if you're flying around in a Discus and someone else is in a JS3, it's not really a fair comparison. So you try and find gliders that are vaguely the same as yours, and have a look. And as you pointed out, Tom, they need to fly in the same air as you at vaguely the same time for it to be a real comparison. But the other thing I suggest to people is, you're ready to fly with water when your climb rate dry is about the same as everyone else on the OLC. So someone like Toby Geiger, I don't think he ever flies dry. So if you have a 15-meter flapped glider, broadly the same as a Ventus, and you can match Toby Geiger for climb rate when you're dry and he's wet, you're doing really well. and you should probably start thinking about water. But if you look, and if Toby Geiger's got a 6 knot average climb and you've only got a 3.5 knot average climb in a similar glider on the same day in the same air, well, you're probably not ready for water yet.
There's one other aspect as well. Toby has an average over, let's say, 7 or 8 hours, and you can't compare that if your average is in the middle of the day over 3 hours.
Yeah.
So that's another thing you got to look out for.
Yeah, in a fit of statistical peak, I pulled a whole stack of flight logs off OLC for a Horsham week, and I looked at all the club class gliders and did a full correlation between speed and every other factor you had available on the OLC stats. The only thing that was significant was climb rate, and it had an R factor of about 0.9. So huge correlation. And I then went and said, okay, well, what's some of the biggest causes of climb rate? And there's a statistic called alt lost, which is the amount of time you spend going down while you are thermally. And it was also a significant factor to predict your climb rate. That's a different topic, or an extension of this topic beyond what we're wanting to cover tonight. But it makes the point as to why our coaching team is very focused on getting you to improve your thermal rate.
Well, everything gets better with better thermaling. And the higher you can stay, the less time you spend climbing. It gives you more opportunities to go further and faster. It is the core skill.
Well, if there's no more questions, I'd just like to thank you, Richard, on behalf of the group. That was probably one of the best presentations I've seen on this topic, and I've seen quite a few, including giving some myself. And just the logical, clear way in which you laid it out was fantastic. And thank you very much from everybody who's itching to give this summer a bit of a tonk.
Thank you. If anyone's got any questions, either send them through to Dave or to answer them, or if you're around Bacchus Marsh, or come and say hello.
Thank you. That was brilliant.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
And if the Geelong guys could just hang on.